Hi everyone, my name is Miku Makino. I am studying economics in the College of Arts and Sciences, and before I start, I just want to put a disclaimer that I'm recovering from a cold right now, so if I have to stop to cough, I'm really sorry. I'll try my best not to. And also I want to express my gratitude to my advisor, Dr. Khan, who's sitting at the front. Thank you so much. So in the field of economics, my interest is in the labor market, and as someone who, after graduating, is going to be entering the Japanese labor market, that is what I wanted to focus on for my project. And specifically, I wanted to look at women and the struggles that they face in Japan in terms of balancing motherhood and working at the same time. So before delving into what I found in my project, I wanted to provide some context. When you imagine the Japanese economy, I think you kind of expect it to be relatively big. It's actually the fourth largest economy in the world. But in comparison to that, I think there are really severely alarming gender disparities that are still existing in the workforce today. Here are some simple statistics that I pulled from the World Economic Forum from its report in 2023. And they have a big ranking called the Global Gender Gap Index ranking, which ranks 146 countries in order of their measure of the gender gap in the workforce. And in this ranking, Japan is at 125, which is relatively low in comparison to the total number of countries, which is 146. They also have sub-rankings, one of which being at the bottom here, economic participation, and in it, Japan ranks 123rd. So you can, even from this simple number, you can tell that Japan is ranking very low in gender disparity in the workforce. Focusing more on Japan as a country, we see that there's a big phenomenon of women leaving the workforce and not returning, and many of these reasons are due to things like marriage, childbirth, childcare, and this is taken from a graph that is posted by the government, and it is data from 10 years ago, but I think it kind of represents the issue that I see here with how alarming this gender disparity is for women who are trying to be mothers as well. And so these observations led me to wonder a few questions, such as why is it so difficult for mothers in Japan to work, as well as why do women in Japan generally just have fewer children? And I came up with my general research question, which was to investigate the relationship between working and having children, and if they mutually affect each other in a way that's causing such great gender disparities in the workforce. In order to answer these questions, my methodology was to do data analysis. So I took data that is published by Keio University, which is a prestigious university in Japan, and the survey is called the Japanese Panel Survey of Consumers, which interviews women ages 29 to 59, all in Japanese, asking numerous questions about their personal life, household information, education, working conditions, and any other related questions. And the survey itself has been conducted since 1993, but I decided to focus on the years 2015 to 2020 to look at more recent trends that are less seen in scholarship. And what I find most interesting about this data is that they have cohorts, which are basically groups that they create every few years that they conduct a survey. And each cohort includes around 2,000 women that they will continue to interview in successive years. And so the data range that I looked at was in this red box here. So I got a good range of different age ranges and cohorts that I was able to look at. And my product was to do the data analysis through a statistical software and write an empirical paper. And I'm going to briefly go over some of the results that I found. One of the first things I looked at was to answer the question, what affects weekly work hours? And so I wanted to look at different factors that are all in the gray boxes and see how and to what extent they affect women's weekly work hours. And the results are shown in this kind of table, but instead of talking through a bunch of numbers, I put it into a simple graphic, which you can see is color-coded with the key above. So the boxes in blue represent a positive effect, which means more of that variable led to an increase in work hours, while a red box means a negative effect, where more of that variable led to a decrease in weekly work hours. So here we find that my top factor at the very top, which is having a baby, that is an indicator for whether or not the respondent, so the women, whether they had a newborn baby in the last year, so whether they are a new mother or not. And we find that that variable has a negative effect on weekly work hours, which shows that having a newborn baby in the last year lessened their work hours, and I think that's intuitive in that it's indicative that they now have to spend more time looking after their children rather than working, and so that has limited their abilities to be able to work more. Other variables I looked at are things like having a spouse, so their marital status, and pre-existing children, which is whether or not they had older children before the newborn child, as well as mother present, which means if under the same roof they also had, they were also living with either their own mother or a mother-in-law to help them lessen their burden of, for example, taking care of their children or doing chores. Another relationship that I looked at was what affects the decision to have a newborn baby. So I was kind of looking at a similar kind of cause and effect relationship, but looking at other factors, including things like age, years of education, and others. And to simplify the results, this is what I found. I'm just going to point out a few things due to time constraints, but one interesting thing I found was that for the factor pre-existing children, I found that if women already had one child, they were still slightly willing to have a newborn baby, versus if they already had 2 or more children, they were much, much less unlikely to have a newborn child. Another interesting fact that I found was for the mother-present variable that was counterintuitive to my initial hypothesis, because I initially assumed that if one was living together with a mother or a mother-in-law, they were able to, they would be more incentivized to have a newborn child, but that is not what I found in my sample. And so to conclude this and other results that I found, basically I was able to find that there's a great volatility of women and their behaviors around childbirth and working in Japan, and that there are certain factors that affect it more than others. And I concluded that if the Japanese government were to implement policies to improve the gender disparity, they would need to focus on things that actually affect mothers and not things that don't affect mothers, such as I found that education doesn't matter in this case. I think that all leads to my kind of conclusion that there's a great value and necessity in providing proper childcare services and implementing policies that provide these proper childcare services, such as having better nursery schools or childcare centers where mothers can depend on those facilities in order to be able to have more time to either take care of their own child or go to work instead. I actually also looked at a governmental policy that they had in 2019 where they reduced the cost of childcare, but we found that that has minimal effect on women in my sample. So I think that was to show that there needs to be stronger policy that actually help women directly and actually have a tangible effect that we can see. And I will say that all these results need to be taken with a grain of salt because they only come from conclusions that I've taken from my own sample, which has some shortcomings, including things like missing values or data that is lost in translation from when being translated to Japanese to English. And as well as my biggest issue that I found was the age range, which was women aged 29 to 59 years old. And of course, there are women that are younger than 29 years old who are also mothers and are affected by this phenomenon. So I think that better samples would yield better conclusions to actually be able to tackle this issue of gender disparities, as well as things like aging population in Japan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll be moving into questions. Miku, thank you for this awesome presentation. Just a question about the years of education. You mentioned that did not end up having any statistical significance, making a difference either way. You mentioned that was surprising. I wonder if you have any explanation for that and maybe how that compares Japan to maybe anything else you encountered coming from other countries.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I found that the years of education attained by the mother does not actually affect their behavior around whether they are willing to have a newborn child. And to me, that was slightly surprising. I feel like I tend to, when I look at relationships in the labor market, I tend to look at the subject's education, and I think that really matters in terms of maybe the job occupation or the level of work that you're able to have. But I found that doesn't actually directly affect mothers as much. And so that led me to think maybe if, for example, for policy making, policies don't need to focus too much on maybe people's education status too much and should be focused on other things that actually affect the relationship that I saw in my regressions.
Hi, Miku. Thanks a lot for the presentation and the work. I know that perhaps you haven't looked into this, but from your intuition, I was wondering how many of these correlations are specific to something rooted in Japanese culture versus things that generalize to other industrialized countries around the world.
Thank you so much for asking that question. Actually, that is a big point of my project and where I started. I think what struck me the most about Japan is that we still struggle with things like traditional values that kind of limit women's abilities to be able to work more and be, fulfill their full potentials. And I think that is a great issue that we need to solve. Another reason why I think this issue exists is because of things like maternity harassment, which is a severe issue in Japan, where mothers that are pregnant in Japan who are still working tend to be harassed in their workforce, which is a really big issue that still exists today. And I think that's part of the reason why gender disparities still exist. And so I think the high magnitude and like the severity that we see of gender gaps and women only being able to work a certain amount of time is sort of unique to Japan. Obviously, I have not quantified what it looks like in other countries, but I think it's definitely a factor that contributes to the relationships that I saw in my regressions. Yeah.
Thank you, Miko. That was great. I have both a metadata question and then a little bit of speculation. So I was fascinated by the fact that your age cohort began at 29. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I was also surprised when I saw that in my data. That is mainly due to the survey just being asked to those aged 29 to 59. I definitely think people younger than that need to be asked similar questions as well in order to kind of get a better understanding of a better representative understanding of the population of women in Japan. But I think that's just from the data themselves. The people who took the data just chose that number. Yeah.
Okay, and then for speculation, you mentioned that some of the policies that were put in place seem to not have the designed effect. And I wonder if you feel comfortable speculating a little bit on maybe a disconnect between the policy makers, what they think influences women and what actually influences women. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. Within the policies that I looked at, they focused on childcare services, and I think policymakers tend to focus on. In Japan, there's a great issue of there not being enough, for example, nursery schools, as well as there being a great lack of teachers to teach at these nursery schools. So I think they tend to focus on providing better labor conditions for those working at nursery schools, but I think there's a disconnect between families who are maybe unable to actually access those nursery schools. Maybe it's not in their region, or maybe they are not able to afford it as much, and I think there is a disparity there that maybe the government can focus a little bit more on to improve upon their existing child care service policies.
Miku, this is so great. I was thinking about, I feel like this is such a timely project, and sort of globally it seems like sometimes the question is framed as, how can we get women equity in the workplace? And sometimes the question is framed as, how can we raise a nation's fertility rate? And what do you think we understand, or like, what is the difference between those two as research questions? What are you more likely to learn or miss if you ask the question about equity in the workplace versus if you just care about having more babies?
I think when I was initially kind of designing this project, I think definitely the first question I kind of wrote down was like the question about birth rates and why women have fewer children. And to me, that kind of seemed to be putting women as just, baby-making machines, which is not what I wanted to focus on for my project. I wanted to focus more on women's abilities to fulfill their potential and have the opportunity and independence to be able to pursue their passions and their careers. Hence, also my project title, which is called The Glass Wall, which is kind of like a wordplay on the idea of the glass ceiling, but more so focusing on women just being able to work in the first place. And I think to me that kind of the difference in those questions to me symbolizes difference in what I'm focusing more on. I think I wanted to focus more on, the capability and opportunities for women in their work rather than just numbers of fertility rates and birth rates and things like that.
Let's give a huge round of applause. And